Hello and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be going back to the 19th century and looking at John Humphrey Noyes and the Oneida community, or the Oneida cult, however you would like to refer to it as. And Chris, this is a very interesting story.
Yes, I think as we get into the story, we're going to find that it has all of the makings of one of those books you would find at the corner of the checkout line going out of Walmart. You know, one of those books that has romance, it's got religion, and ultimately their whole goal is not far off from what people are wanting to experience in life, this idea of utopia, of a perfect society. The problem is how you go about getting it.
Yeah, he goes in a very interesting direction, and I think, to say the least, is interesting, but he goes in a very interesting direction. He starts out, though, in a very normal way. John Humphrey Noyes was born in Vermont in 1811. He comes from all intents and purposes, a good home. His father, John Noyes, was a congressman and a graduate of Dartmouth University. His mother, Polly Noyes, was a number of years younger than her husband and his father. And she was a deeply pious and deeply religious woman who taught her children, of course, to go to church and to fear the Lord and that kind of thing. And she had hoped and prayed that John Noyes would become a minister. And, of course, that doesn't happen for a long time. He is something of a rabble-rouser in his younger years. He enters Dartmouth University in 1826. There's a revival there under the ministry of Charles Finney, but he is not impacted by this at all. He's still somewhat of a rabble-rouser and sort of looking at religion in a very suspicious sort of way. But he's going to attend a revival in Vermont, again with Charles Finney, the minister Charles Finney. First, he's not all that caught up in it, but later on he does get caught up in the religious movement, and he is converted there. He embraces Christianity. He embraces what we would call premillennialism, the idea that Christ will return and set up a kingdom. So he embraces millennial theology. He's going to go to Andover and Yale Divinity School, thinking he's going to go into the ministry, sort of, I guess, answering the prayers of his mother. But it's while he's there at Yale that he comes to a different understanding, I guess we could say, Chris, of sanctification in the Christian life. And he adopts an idea called perfectionism, which is basically the idea that a person could reach a state of perfection or sinlessness at conversion.
Yeah, let's be real here that John Noyes believed that he had been appointed by God.
Yeah.
So this was a calling that had been put onto his life. And, as we study about the different religious denominations in America, we find these stories. We can go and look at the story of Mormonism. We can look at other religions and how individuals espouse that they've been called by God to bring together a group of people to achieve a specific aspect of life, if you will. And you mentioned this idea of perfectionism, and that if you are strong enough, so if you have a relationship with Christ that is so strong, then what can happen is you can be free of sin. Now, Ray, I don't know about you, but there is sin all over the place in this world.
Yep.
And how do you try to remove yourself from sin and still be in the world? It's just one of those things that's impossible to actually try to put in. But here's what they really thought. He thought that heaven resembled a place where people of all socioeconomic backgrounds, of all colors, of all things, that basically they all came together into this one place. And what happened is you would live selflessly as one family. So in heaven, you're going to live together and everybody's equal. And not only are they equal in just being individuals, but they share all of their property, they share all of their work, and they share all of their love. And that was what he thought heaven was like. And so he wanted this idea of heaven on earth. And so he said, okay, we're going to create the society known as a utopian society where everybody will get along, love, live, serve, work, be together, and there will be no violence, no evil, no sin. We're going to live in perfect harmony, and I'm called to the task. That's a pretty big task.
It is, and all of it is sort of based on this perfectionism, which he embraces, Chris. He embraces it wholeheartedly. This belief in perfectionism costs him his ordination. He was not allowed to be ordinated because he was expressing this particular view. So in 1834, he starts, I guess you could say, developing even more of these theories, and he starts writing, or that we're going to talk about, and he starts writing articles. And in his first article, which he published, I believe, in 1837, he actually denounced marriage as an institution. He wasn't a big fan of it, and of course, there's a little bit of backlash against that. And through his articles and through his writings, the granddaughter of the lieutenant governor, a lady called Harriet Holton, she sort of takes an interest in him, and she starts supporting him. And then in June of 1838, Noyes writes her, and you know what he does?
What's that?
He proposes marriage to this young lady. And he later says that he got married only for the purpose of advancing the kingdom of God and the work of God. So, he says, and I'll quote what he says, "By this marriage, beside herself and a good social position, which she held as belonging to the first families of Vermont, I obtained money enough to buy a house and a printing office and to buy a press and a type." And he started a newsletter called The Witness, this publication. He's also going to start a Bible Institute where he will, in 1836, where he will help train other people. He starts slowly gathering followers to himself, and in 1840, he pulls together the Putney Association, and they live in a number of houses. They worship together. They have a small chapel there. His father donates money, and this is where we start. It's sort of in this year, in the 1840s, when he starts really coming to this idea of mutual criticism, complex marriage, and some other ideas that are going to be practiced by him and his followers at a place called, or a place we could refer to, I guess, as their kingdom on earth. This place at Putney where this Oneida community would gather.
Yeah, and we have to recognize that there was some things that he was doing that could have been seen for the good. He was very adamant about education. Yes. And people learning, and the watchword of the Oneida community was all about improvement. That in everything you do, you're trying to improve to this aspect of perfectionism. So in every work you say, in everything you do, you're always trying to be perfect. Mm-hmm. And so with that came education. They would read, and they would get together and talk, and they would discuss things. But you also had the obligation that when you read something, when you learned a new trade, you had the responsibility that you needed to pass it on, that you needed to train someone else. None of those things is bad. They grew vegetables, and they had farm, and they were very careful about what they put into their bodies, because they believed that certain things that were put into your bodies could cause illness, could cause disease and other things. However, they also thought that certain kinds of vegetable might reform and might purify the life, and so that was important also. They had, as you mentioned, famous people that actually showed up and discussed various ideas of society and change and culture. They discussed African American bondage with the famed anti-slavery activist Frederick Douglass. He actually came to the mansion house that Noyes had built, right, and they discussed these things. And so there are some things that you say, okay, not bad, but oh my gosh, then he just starts going in another direction.
Yeah, he gets this idea of something called complex marriage. And Chris, when I think of famous cults in American history, it seems like so many times you see something like this develop. And we see that here with Noyes, with this idea of complex marriage. And in complex marriage, it was basically the idea that every man in the community was married to every woman in the community. And that, therefore relations, quote unquote, between any man and any woman within the community was legal. And by the way, in case you think, well, that would have been sin, remember in Noyes' theology, it could not be sin because a converted person was sinless. And they had two rules that couples, I guess you could say couples, within the community had to follow. Number one is they couldn't approach someone and say, let's have, quote unquote, relations. They had to go through a third person. So they had to find someone else to go to that other person to, I guess, arrange things.
And by the way, that third person was an older person,
yes,
someone who had, quote, wisdom, and someone that they thought could guide, hey, that's a good match, or that's a bad match. And so you have that conversation as well, you know what I mean? But can you imagine, you're talking about thinking, oh wow, I really like that person, I'd like to be intimate with them, but I got to go to grandma basically and ask grandma, hey, is it okay if she and I come together? And if grandma says yes, then you have the permission of grandma, which is kind of gross in itself. But then if grandma says no, then there's a whole nother thing. She's going to then recommend who you should be with. So grandma's always in the picture.
And not only that, don't get too attached to the person grandma set you up with, because the second rule they had is you were not allowed to have, like an exclusive relationship with anyone in the community. And if it was suspected that you and another person were spending too much time together, you would be separated for a period of time and not allowed to even see each other. So this was a very unusual situation, and you can certainly understand why people in the outside community, outside the Oneida community there, would of course be alarmed by some of the things they were hearing coming out of this group. And of course, complex marriage brings us to another aspect of the Oneida group, and that's ascending fellowship. And Chris, you sort of just talked about it, but people who were coming into the group, younger people, would be picked out by a person who had been in the group longer and who theoretically, I guess you could say, was older, to be, I guess you could say, for the lack of a better term, trained. So, and they were referred to as central members, by the way. So a central member who was a man, would pick one of these young girls that was coming into the community, and he would, quote unquote, train her. So I guess you could say that he would have relations with her. An older woman would pick a younger man coming into the community and would have the same type of situation where they would sort of train them, quote unquote. So you see this complex marriage not only as part of life in the community, but in coming into the community as well.
Yeah, and if we use the language of the Oneida community, when you're using the term relations, they actually called them social interviews.
Yes.
And the social interviews could only be limited to a maximum of 1 hour time. And so it was very detailed. And in addition to that, it was also stated that Noyes specifically said that those individuals only came together to have a social interview, that you could not sleep with the other sex, because in his mind, the coming together of man and woman for the social interview was not to sleep, but it's to edify and to enjoy. And if you're sleeping, you can't enjoy. Mm-hmm. There's nothing there, right? It prevents sociability and any of those things. But Ray, think about this quote from Noyes that he wrote. He said, "Ascending fellowship is the foundation of our social system, and there will be a time when a young person with no forcing," and I think that's important because he was adamant that this not be anything but consensual, although that's to be debated. But he said, with no forcing, will a young person naturally be led by the hand of some older person in matters of love, when the idea of persons that are not spiritual embarking on the tempestuous ocean of amativeness without a pilot will be regarded as absurd? So in other words, he's basically saying, listen, on your own you can't find someone that you can relate to, and you need someone with wisdom, someone who is older. And Ray, we're looking at Ascending Fellowship, and we're looking at these social interviews, we're thinking, oh my gosh, this is crazy. Right. But how many times do you hear moms and dads say, oh, I want you to really get to know this person, or I'd love for you to spend more time with that person? Is it possible? You know, we hear in world history about arranged marriages and all of these things. Is it possible that Noyes wasn't just taking some of that and putting it into his own theology, and though we wouldn't want to admit it, that maybe
it a little bit, yeah,
and that maybe in society today that older people don't try to guide people into who they should be with and what character traits they should follow and be around?
Yeah, I won't comment on that, but
not advocating for social interviews.
I will let that float out there, Chris, and I am not commenting on it at all. It's an interesting idea. I mean, of course, he wasn't really going for long-term relationships with these people. Like you said, he was just going for a brief encounter, and if anybody had spent too much time together, you know, they would be separated.
And add to this, Ray, that most of the people that came into the Oneida community were married.
Yeah.
So you're going into this community as a husband and wife, and when you get there, Noyes says, oh, hey, by the way, that ain't going to work well here because we're trying to get to perfectionism, and so I'm going to need you to love everybody, and you're going to be everybody's just going to be sharing everything. And how do you do that? I mean, it's just, I guess I go back to, you mentioned it about a cult, but how did people actually agree to all of this? What made them say, yeah?
I think maybe just a sense of belonging, you know, a sense of community, a sense of purpose. I think he had to have been, and I remember from my research for this, that he was considered a very handsome fella and apparently quite a dynamic personality. So I think you take people who are looking for something, looking for, you know, to be a part of something, looking to be a part of this new religious movement, and I think you take the right people, and you know, you could convince them to get into this type of a situation. And, you know, I think it is important our listeners to remember this group never grew that large. We're not talking about thousands of people. I think by 1878, it was around 300 people, and that was about as big as it ever got. You know, so it wasn't like we're talking about thousands of people, but I think, yeah, you could find enough people to pull something like this together. It's just a very interesting thing. And, you know, we're talking about complex marriage and ascending fellowship, but another thing that all, you know, was different. But another thing they did, which I find just weird, was mutual criticism. And it is exactly what it sounds like, Chris, where every member of the community, except Noyes himself, who thought it would be inappropriate for people to criticize their leader, so he wasn't subjected to this. But every other member could be put through this situation where they can be publicly and openly criticized by any other member of the group, but more importantly, at least as far as the way I see it, in a group. So in a congregational type setting, they could just unload on any person in the group, and it was seen as being edifying and helpful, which I just can't figure out for the life of me.
So we have this idea of which basically what happens is if somebody saw fault in you, then they had the right to pretty much call you out on it. Yeah. But wasn't it true that you had to sit there and be quiet?
Yeah, you had to take it. There was no defending yourself, because you defended yourself. You weren't learning the lesson of the criticism.
Yeah, and so I mean, think about this. It was everybody's responsibility to examine other people, mm-hmm. and instead of trying to help them be edified and to be made to feel good, I guess, what you're supposed to do is to look at their defects and their weaknesses. And that, I mean, my gosh, calling out everything that is objectionable. And you have to sit there and take it. And not only do you just take it, but when it's done, you have to act on it.
Yeah.
I mean, yes.
Yeah, I would not be a good member of the Oneida community.
No, I mean, my gosh,
I would have all sorts of problems.
This and
I can see me now. How dare you say that about me? Let me tell you about you. It would not go well.
Because we have a hard time now being quiet and just listening, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But according to Noyes, what he was trying to do is he wanted people to see themselves through the eyes of others.
Right.
That it would cause humility. It would bring about selflessness, and
Bring
I think,
the
as you
community
said,
closer together.
yeah, it brings the community closer. It brings you closer to God. You recognize the error of your ways, and once again, in today's society, we don't go that far with that, right? But we do have these things nowadays about accountability partners, where we do want people to hold us accountable. Mm-hmm. Except they can go too far, right? Because we say, hold me accountable and make sure I don't eat chocolate. But don't you dare talk about my Diet Pepsis or whatever it is. We have limits.
And don't drag me in front of the church and have the whole church throw stones at me verbally.
Could you imagine that?
I could not. I mean, can you imagine if a church tried to do that today? It would not go over well at all. I don't think we're unique in that.
But imagine, not even just a church, but imagine in the classroom. Okay, class, today it's mutual criticism time. I mean, my gosh, we have.
Well, Chris. No, we won't
let that float in the air. It's sad. It's really sad. But Ray, let's just kind of end this by reminding our listeners that all of us, as weird as this might be, that just about everyone that's involved in this podcast today has probably invested in the Oneida community.
Yeah, that's the interesting part.
All of us have given money for the support of the Oneida community, and how have we done that? I mean, why don't you deliver up a spoonful of sugar about how that happens? Yeah,
the community itself sort of dissipated in a sense. In 1876, Noyes hands over leadership to his son, Theodore Noyes, and that doesn't go well. The guy is not the type of leader his father was. Things sort of fall apart. Noyes himself has to flee to Canada because he finds out there's a warrant for his arrest for statutory rape. So in 1879, he flees to Canada, never to return to the United States. So basically the community itself breaks apart, but a lot of the work they were doing continues, and one of the works that they were doing was making silverware, spoons in particular, and the company for Oneida is still around today, still producing spoons.
And if you open up your cupboard at home and your kitchen cabinets and you take out a spoon and you look on the back and it just might say Oneida, and it just gives you a pause.
Yeah, but I think it is important for our listeners to know that if you buy Oneida cutlery, you're not supporting some strange cult. The cult aspect, the weird community aspect died off in the late 19th century. Now it's just a company that makes spoons.
Yeah, they actually got mad at Noyes. And didn't they kick him out?
Well, he was removed, yeah.
And they brought the son in and then realized he's horrible. He's worse than the dad.
And they bring the dad back, and then dad has to flee to Canada. So, yeah, it didn't go too terribly well.
So what's the lesson we learned from the Oneida community?
Don't join a group practicing mutual criticism and complex marriage.
And the other thing is...
That's my number one lesson.
Yeah, and it always says research.
Yeah,
do your research.
Yeah.
I mean, before you invest in a company or before you invest in a social group or whatever it is, always know what you're getting into.
Yeah. Just look at if you not just simply a company or investment, but friendships, all sorts of things.
Absolutely.
Take a look at who a person is, who they hang around, and what people think about them.
And is it not true that sometimes we go in with the best intentions, with the right goal in mind. I mean, let's be real. The guy just wanted to be like Christ.
Yeah.
All he wanted was to bring heaven to earth. He wanted to be a utopian society. I'm pretty confident that every single one of us would be happy that there would be no war, there would be no lying, stealing, cheating, or anything. I mean, that's utopia. And all he was doing was trying to bring about utopia. He just went about a very weird and damaging way of doing it. And instead of utopia, he brought about dysfunction.
Yeah, it didn't work. You know, Chris, one last thing, we'll land the plane here, but one last thing that I sort of stumbled across here was the last surviving original member of the Oneida community. Her name was Ella Underwood, and she died at the age of 101 in Kenwood, New York, which apparently is near Oneida, New York, on June 25, 1950. So it's been, let's say that's 70 some years since the last person who was actually a part of that original group died. So everybody who was associated with the original group is now gone. But what that does mean though, and I don't know, I didn't actually look into this, but they could have like children and grandchildren still alive today. So there may be real recent connections.
It still lives on.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about it today.
Yeah.
And I mean, if we're talking about it, it's important.
Absolutely. We wouldn't be talking about it on History You Didn't Know But Should if you shouldn't know about it. Chris, thanks for another great episode. And if you're looking for more information about History You Didn't Know But Should, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter. You can find our podcast on Stitcher, Sounder FM, Spotify, Google Podcasts, anywhere where you get your podcast almost. So until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And talk to you later.